The early part of January would see continuation of the dev blogs about the upcoming Italy DLC for Steel Division 2, as well as a yearly roundup. On the Warno side of things, they were slowly building up to the January 20th release, with some dev blogs around the lore and the maps of the game. And on January 20th, just a month after it being announced, Warno would release into the Steam stores as early access. The early access release for Warno would be a bit controversial, to say the least, partly due to my part with the video I released just before the game launched, pretty much cautioning people to buy it, because in my opinion, Eugen didn't do a good enough job communicating that the game was early access, one could say. I don't think I did a good enough job explaining my points during that video of my issue with the game being released so early. So let's just take some time and go back into that mess. So, first impressions matter a lot, whether it's dating, job interviews, or your third time showing up to court for public indecency. That first impression you give on people is going to stick. Frankly, the first impression which many people had of Warno when they bought the game on January 20th, or 25% off, which was quite kind of Eugen, was a pretty sorry state. And a lot of people I know, not just in the online realm, but also in real life, looked at Warno or played it on launch, didn't like it because of the bare bones state it was in, and then just refunded the game and haven't looked at it since. Here's a small anecdote. I was at a baby shower a few months back, and one of the guys I know here plays a lot of Wargame. So of course the topic of Wargame came up, we were comparing our favourite decks and our favourite units, and then the topic of Warno came up. I went to him saying, hey, have you tried Warno? It's a pretty fun game, you'd probably like it a lot. It's pretty similar to Wargame, but you know, a bit different, more modernised, all of that stuff. He was like, no, I haven't. I saw some gameplay of it, like, earlier on in the year, and it just looked like a worse version of Wargame, so I've just continued playing Wargame. And then it was an uphill battle of trying to convince him that, hey, Warno, they fixed it now. What you saw, like, back in March, it's not like it anymore. It's a really fun game. And this is a position which Eugen Systems put themselves in by honestly releasing the game too early. Yes, you can hide behind the defense that it is early access, but early access these days is a pretty perverted term. I mean, there's many games in early access which end up becoming bloody fantastic, and a bunch of others which just never end up getting really released. In my opinion, it would have been better if they just waited a few months to launch a game, rather than just trying to get out the door early on in January, only a month after the game been announced. You give it a few months to bake in the oven, add some more divisions, add some more maps, fix up some of the core balance issues of the game, which you don't need a large player base to Q&A. A small strike team can actually do their job and fix those issues. And then over those few months, you trickle feed information about the game to get people hyped up, and then you release a little less buggy and broken version, where there's actually more stuff to do with your $30 spent. I think I would have had a pretty awesome release. But Eugen Systems put themselves in a very unnecessary position by releasing it too early. The only reason I could think that they wanted to get the game out so early was just a cash injection of getting some income now to help with the development of the game. Yeah, that's pretty much my main issue with the early access release. It was not so much that I didn't think Eugen was going to fix the game. I was fairly confident they would end up doing that. It's more, they just really put themselves in a very poor position for a new IP, just kind of rush a product out the door without having some quality control to it. Because in the end of the day, even though it is early access, you're still buying a product, and even though it is early access, you kind of want a product which you can use and play with immediately, even if it is a little bit buggy and bare bones. Frankly, the betas for Steel Division 2 and Wargame Red Dragon, SD44, were handled much better, honestly. Anyway, let's leave that topic to rest. Don't worry guys, there's going to be even more rants in this video. I've got my soapbox polished and ready. So, let's just get on with the rest of January would see the Warno roadmap being revealed. pretty much the gist of it is that every 2 weeks they plan to add more content to the game. They'd fall a little bit behind that 2-week schedule, but they did mention that in the dev blog that was more of an estimation. And then they would release their first major patch for Warno, pretty much just fixing some of the more immediate issues with the game. February would see the Tribute to the Liberation of Italy DLC being released for Steel Division 2. It has a rather hefty price tag, but frankly, it's a pretty damn good DLC. The divisions they added are top quality. A lot of new units, interesting playstyles, and just really cool divisions in general. They did a very good job with this release. There'd also be patches coming along with this release, such as some changes to the maps. Vehicle flamethrowers were buffed, as well as light tanks and tank machine guns. There was buffs to divisions such as 17th and 352nd. Panzer got some Panzer Shreks, and also SD44 got a patch. The Warno side of things, Milestone Nay would end up being released, the first major content release for Warno, adding 2 new divisions, some new units, as well as a new 10v10 map, which you know it's a Eugen Systems map because the entire map is just bridge warfare. What is it with Eugen Systems and bridge choke points? There'd also be another patch later on in the month, Dead Zone, with its major feature being the rework of the CV mechanic to no longer need a deployment CV to continue spawning in units, which was a change I was first honestly against, but now, especially after a few months, I'm very much in favour of it. It completely stops CV sniping, but you can still do real-line shenanigans if so inclined. March would end up seeing some of the more overperforming divisions from the Italian DLC being nerfed, as well as some new versions of the Tannenberg map. Also, surprisingly, another Army General campaign would end up being released. It would be pitting Axis Hungary versus Allied Romania, who switched sides. This DLC, well, as far as today, has not been released yet, and over the rest of the year, they would end up trickle-feeding more information out the Battle of Turda. March would end up seeing some more maps being released for Warno, as well as a time limit option for lobbies, which is honestly a lifesaver. 40 minutes would end up being the standard, just like in Wargame, as well as 2 new divisions, a West German and an East German Panzer division. The next major milestone for Warno, Murat, would end up being delayed all the way to the start of May, with one of its major additions being modern support through the Steam Workshop. I want to give a big shout out to one of my favourite mods, the UI Overhaul Dark theme, created by Ajor. It's frankly a fantastic UI scheme. It's much easier to read compared to the vanilla UI. I really wish they just add this UI as the official one to the game. It would add 2 new divisions, an East and West German infantry division, both having access to Fallschirmjägers, and these Fallschirmjägers would be able to forward deploy, slowly leading into the meta of forward deployment being king in 1v1s. They'd also add ATGMs and recoilless rifle teams, as well as reworking how infantry combat works in general. There's also be another minor patch later on in the month, removing all the T-64s from the game. I hope we see them back sometime soon. It's a rather favourite tank of mine, and replacing them with the more appropriate T-62. They'd also add some Su-27s. On June the 16th, Raid on Dvar would finally be released, after 462 days of winning the previous Nemesis vote. It ended up actually being a pretty decent DLC. The divisions are nothing really crazy, they're more gimmicky and historical than anything, but they're pretty fun. I mean, now you can shoot explosive Italian helmets at your opponent. There also was a patch which came along with the DLC, reworking the Maverick and balance economies, nerfing satchel charges as a whole, and also buffing German half-tracks. And with one Nemesis division finally being released, another Nemesis vote would end up being brought back onto the table, with 3 options being available: the Battle of Tianhara, the Siege of Dunkirk, and breaching the Gothic line. In the Warno world, it would end up being a preview for one of the new divisions which was about to be added, the VDV division. And within the VDV division, they didn't just have access to hips and hinds, oh no, they got alligators with the KA-50. There was quite a bit of controversy around this unit, so let's take some time to talk about the KA-50 drama. But I think under the surface of the baseline historical accuracy arguments and oh, Americans have AMRAAMs and AT4s, there's a little bit more to unpack. Well, fortunately for us, World War III didn't actually happen. Well, yet so far. So with a lot of these Cold War scenarios, such as Red Storm Rising, World in Conflict, Regiments, and Warno, these are all just the author's interpretation of what would actually happen in a Cold War situation gone hot. And there's honestly, in this alternative history timelines, a lot of uncertainty, especially in regards to unit equipment and organizational structures. If we look at World War II, for example, when these divisions and armies went into actual contact with the enemy, their organizations and divisions and equipment structures changed quite rapidly. That's a whole other discussion. But with the limitation of the fantasy set, well, the author's gonna just have to make some best guesses in what does and what does not fit within the timeline. For me personally, whether it's KA-50s, AT4s, AMRAAMs, I'm honestly not too bothered about prototype units, which may or may not, 1 or 2 years off making it into the timeline, being added into the game. Just as long as you don't go into the pure fantasy, like F-22s, I think we're going to be fine. Between the balance of historical accuracy and gameplay, I definitely lean much more towards the gameplay side. Just as long as these units improve the gameplay by adding more diverse, fun equipment and strategies which you can employ, I'm all for them being added into the game. However, I do think there's an underlying discussion behind this initial KA-50 discussion. I think that discussion is the threat of a re-emerging super heavy meta from Wargame. To clarify, for those who didn't play Wargame, throughout the Wargame franchise, they increased the timeline of the game quite a bit. It started in the mid-80s, but with Red Dragon, it ended up in mid-90s era of equipment, some early 2000 stuff thrown in as well. And you saw an emergence of better, more powerful super units and prototypes like Apache Longbows, T-90s, M180 Abrams. You can name them all off, and a bunch of weird prototypes. This ended up changing the meta of Wargame quite a bit, as the game came more towards about using these super powerful heavy units to dominate the battlefield. Now, Wargame does actually have pretty decent balance, but you can't deny that the super heavy meta in Wargame definitely still has its presence, even throughout all of these balance updates. And honestly, I think with Warno, this threat of a super heavy meta, of just using single powerful units to dominate the battlefield, won't really be that much of an issue, and that's just due to the core underlying structure of the game, with it being division-based rather than nation-based. As the problem with Red Dragon is you could play nations and coalitions, you have a huge variety of units, so you just kind of take the best super units in all the tabs, and with some divisions, or I should say nations, you don't exactly have that many weaknesses. I'm looking at you on Tom. However, of all the current super units in Warno in the game, they're all relatively spread out between divisions. You could argue 3rd and 79th has a larger variety of them compared to others, but they also have cons as well, because that's how the division system works. It's a much more limited deck building system, which forces, divisions in theory, to actually have weaknesses. And also currently the meta right now for Warno is definitely more cheaper, cost-effective units rather than superpower units. But let's remember, this is Eugen Systems we're dealing with here, and they do have a history of, power creep in their games with new DLCs which add new nations and divisions. And Warno will probably have the same fate. Their company, they're going to try and sell these new DLCs by adding gimmicky units and gimmicky divisions, which have some core new mechanics, as previous examples of this with Wargame and SD2. So this whole time frame thing, it's an inevitability that they're going to stretch it out as much as possible, so they could just, add more cooler units and sell more DLCs, because in the end of the day, they're a company. That's what they're going to do. And especially with, I'm gonna bet with sequels, they're going to stretch it out, and we'll probably get back to the Wargame Red Dragon era, probably in a sequel or two, and have M180 Abrams duking out against T-72 BUs. Anyway, that's my long-winded opinion on an argument which has been argued about to death half a year ago. So let's just get on with the rest of the video, there's still a lot to cover. And on June 16th, the Lannis milestone would end up being released, adding 2 new maps, as well as 2 new parachute divisions, the 82nd Airborne, as well as the previously mentioned VDV division. And these 2 divisions really added some much needed spice of life to Warno, as these light infantry divisions were quite a bit different from the current standard of mechanized and armor divisions which we've seen so far. And in the middle of July, the next major milestone would end up being released for Warno, Messena, adding my favourite style of division into these games, shit tier reserve divisions with Territorial Commando Sud and the KDA. Also, they would end up adding some new maps and remixing a bunch of the older ones for different playstyle sizes, and there was also a pretty large balance change between unit availability and price costs across the board. Also, the Nemesis vote would come to a close, and the Siege of Dunkirk would end up being the victor. Personally, I was hoping for Tianhara to win. I guess next time I just need to stuff some more ballots. We would see a small balance patch for Steel Division 2 in August, reworking some minor units, but more importantly, adding the time limit option in lobbies. Warno patch for this month would end up seeing game code being reworked a bit, so it doesn't take up as much hard drive space, which is much appreciated, Eugene. They'd also end up adding a new map Ripple, improving smoke on vehicles, and also completely reworking artillery to frankly just make it more lethal. And because of the lethality of this artillery rework, later on in the month they had to do another patch to nerf the artillery. The September patch for Steel Division 2 would add a much wanted change, allowing infantry, or partially some infantry, to survive transport death, because some angry Russians with a big honking rifle were being a bit annoying behind enemy lines. We'd also see the Churchill and Cromwell getting buffed, as well as German pioneers as a whole getting buffed. The next Warno milestone, Bessières, would end up being released, adding the 1st British and 5th French armour divisions, 2 new maps, one of them being Crown, which is a damn good 10v10 map, good job Eugene, as well as reworking the Geyser map to be not as, well, lame. There would also be a massive patch log along with this release, adding new units to existing divisions and reworking some of the units, improving speed, reworking HP on helicopters and jeeps, nerfing artillery even further, and honestly just a whole heap of balance and price changes all over the place. And then to top it on further, there would be another patch later on in the month, mainly just to fix the new units added in the new divisions. The last major release for Warno would end up coming out in October with Milestone Suchet, adding the French parachute division as well as a British infantry division. It'd also be even more balance changes, such as mortar rework, adding ECM on helicopters to make them even more survivable, and just a whole heap of statistical changes on a whole heap of units. But most importantly is that the VDV division got the T-64s, making it officially the best division in game. Also, ATGM infantry figured out where the front door of a building is, so good for them. They also previewed the Army General and Operations mode and how they're going to function for the more single player portion of the game, and also announced they're going to be working on actual tutorials, which is better than last time of just having YouTube videos on the front page of the game. Also, Eugene would announce more content for Warno outside of the original scope of the game, the Battle of Berlin. Pretty much just 2 actual divisions, one of them being a Western ragtag force to defend Berlin, and then an Eastern little less ragtag force who would be planning to attack the city of Berlin. The main thing is that we'd end up seeing the announcement of the F117 Nighthawk being added to the game to the Western Front Defense Division. Honestly, good on Eugene for adding some extra free content to the game, especially after the whole early access fiasco. In November, there'd be some more content for Warno, with HMG and automatic grenade launch teams being added, as well as everyone's favourite game mode, Destruction Mode. Autocannons were entirely reworked, there'd be more smoke launchers on more vehicles, the 1st British Armoured would get some paratroopers to buff out its infantry tab, Siege was buffed so it wasn't actually worthless, and there's honestly just a whole heap of balance changes. Some of the more notable ones is that the Patchy Rocket got a big buff, as you can now get 2 of them per card, and the SU-25 lost AP. There'll also be another patch later on in the month, being the final patch this year for Warno. Pretty much a whole heap of price changes. The Patchy Rockets got nerfed just a little bit. The SU-25 received AP rounds again, now becoming the king of the battlefield, and artillery got nerfed even further. There's also an announcement that they are actually 100% going to be adding an urban map to Warno, which is something which people have just been wanting really forever now. Is there going to be a map editor? And to cap off the year, Steel Division 2 would receive one final patch for the year at least, just readjusting a bunch of prices, availability, and also nerfing the PE2. And for Warno, there would be an announcement of a complete mechanical rework of how the entirety of combat works in the game, adjusting how suppression works, how veterancy works, add in unit traits, and also looking to completely revamp the command system so CVs don't have to be so static. This is honestly a pretty exciting announcement, as this fixes a lot of the current issues with the game, with just how infantry combat works, how suppression, stunning works. I'm very much looking forward to see how this actually affects the game into the next year when they start implementing it, especially unit traits, because you can do a lot of fun stuff with unit traits. And that's the nitty-gritty of everything which has happened throughout the year. So I think now, at the end of this video, it'd be a good time to reflect and summarize. Apparently people like it when I summarize things on just the game's current position and what is the potential future for Eugen Systems. So let's get into it. So first up, is Wargame, because we've heard literally nothing about Wargame this entire year. But that's not really that much of a bad thing. The last patch / DLC for Wargame, the South Africa run, was really top quality stuff. The DLC as well as the patch changes were fantastic, and Wargame is in a pretty damn good state now. And I'm fairly certain the people playing Wargame are going to continue playing Wargame till the heat death of the universe. I do want to give a quick shout out, however, to the BWC mod. It is essentially just Wargame for modern day. Mechanically, they don't change too much. They add some new units like cruise missiles and suicide drones, as well as suicide bombers, which is really awesome. It's a lot of fun. They add in a lot of new content to it. I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in Wargame. The link to it is in the description below. Go play it, it's very OP. On the Steel Division side of things, I think it's safe to say that the game is starting to reach its end of life, as Warno is probably going to release sometime early next year. It'd be curious if they do decide to do more Steel Division 2 content after the Romanian Army General DLC and the Siege of Dunkirk. Especially considering that the Steam store page for Steel Division 2 is starting to look like a Paradox game. However, there's a little quick tangent I want to get off my chest about Steel Division 2. Considering that the game is starting to become end of life, it'd probably be a pretty good idea just to make the base game free to play, have the skirmish and multiplayer free, with the baseline divisions all available, and then just charge money for the vanilla Army General campaign, and then of course all of the regular DLC. And then with this influx of new people trying out the game, of course they're going to want to play with their favourite units and divisions, whether it's King Tigers or Western Front divisions, so they'll be more likely to drop money on specific DLCs for nations they'll be interested to play in. And this hybridization of a sort of free-to-play system of just having some base divisions and the multiplayer be free, I think it'd be a pretty good idea even for Warno, as it would help deal with one of the major issues of just the low player count and the vicious lobby PvP cycle. Lobby PvP is really the end game of all of these games. Apart from that, Steel Division 2 has been one of Eugen Systems' most supported games post-launch. Just the amount of stuff they've added since release is pretty insane. There's over 100 divisions in the game now, so they do deserve a pat on the back, especially considering the breadth the game has taken in regards to coverage of World War II. And now we get to Warno, which has had a very rocky release at the start of the year, but now, let's be real, it's in a pretty good state. They've definitely stepped up to the plate and fixed a lot of the major issues with the game. However, I still think there's 3 major issues to still be addressed, so let's go over them. First one is this anti-aircraft play, how helicopters and airplanes work and interact. AA in general just feels like you're using a riffle bat to try to bassaray a Wolverine. You just end up getting bloodied in the end with the scars to prove it. Especially with how helicopters work. I'm not very happy with how helicopters work, and I'm very vocal on people using helicopters a bit too aggressively. My main problem with helicopters in Warno is that they are more responsive and more lethal compared to how they were in Wargame, which is great. They shouldn't be as clunky compared to Wargame. However, they're also more tanky. It can take 3 to 4 hits to kill some of the more advanced attack helicopters. And this leads to helicopters being extremely effective on the offense. Even if you don't have recon, you can very much take a risk throwing your helicopters in an anti-aircraft net and then being able to get them out alive while still doing some damage, which is frankly gameplay I don't exactly enjoy. Even though there's problems with Wargame, how they handled helicopters was pretty fantastic. The main use for helicopters was as a defensive firefighting unit, to plug holes in your lines where the enemy makes massive breakthroughs as they overextend, and also to punish enemies who don't have any anti-air on certain flanks so you can come on around and start blowing them up. Pretty much glass cannon gameplay is really how helicopters should function. They should be extremely lethal, extremely mobile, but if they get caught by even Man-Patch or an OSA AKM, they should go down relatively quickly. Second issue here is forward deployment, and just how bloody powerful it can be, as being able to get a bunch of highly vetted airborne infantry into a city before the enemy can even has a chance to get in allows you to fortify it and pretty much lock down that zone or make it an absolute meat grinder to try to take back. However, I don't think it's just forward deployment which is the issue. It's just a symptom of the main cause, is that a lot of the 1v1 map zones suck. The maps themselves are honestly pretty decent with how they're laid out. The command zone placement, on the other hand, is a whole other ballgame. The 2 best examples I can give, and I'm purely speaking mainly from a 1v1 sense, as that's what I mainly play in Warno, is 2 Lakes and Vertigo. And the problem here is that there's really only 2 lanes of attack. The map is pretty much choke pointed to these 2 central zones. So it's very important for you to get into that zone and deploy early, because there's not going to be a whole lot of maneuver one can do to try to make up for losing said zone. I think a good example of some better map designs can actually be brought back to wargames, such as Hell in a Very Small Place and A Nuclear Winter is Coming. These maps are pretty wide, have multiple command zones, pretty much multiple lanes of angles for you to attack down, so even if you do lose one zone and the enemy locks it down and fortifies it, you still have room to maneuver. And this is the main issue currently of a lot of 1v1 Warno maps. You end up just getting choke pointed out of these zones, and if you lose that initial engagement, you either have to just play a really slow, boring meat grinder, or you just lose. And the Warno maps, especially in 1v1, to try to focus on encouraging the player to maneuver around the map, rather than just getting choke pointed out of it. Both of these maps, if you just rearrange the command zones a bit, you could at least add 3 different central command zones which one has to attack over, which would end up encouraging more fluid gameplay, as if you get locked out of the town in Vertigo, for example, heck, maybe that'd be a reason you could push through the middle with your armoured tank division. I think this is something Eugen should really start to explore. I understand they always have a difficult time reworking maps. They have so they can do it, but just reworking the command zones on some of these maps and just readjusting them a bit, you could get some really fantastic 1v1 maps here. And my final issue I have is more of a philosophical one. What is Warno? What is it trying to be? Of course, there is the classic debate we've been having for pretty much over a decade now of Eugen Systems games, about whether they're realism games or whether they're focused more on balance. We're not going to get into that kind of realms, because by God, that's been talked about to death by now. However, there's another angle that we can speak about of Warno, is Warno more like Steel Division, or is it like Wargame? As right now, Warno's in a pretty weird state, as it's trying to be both Steel Division and Wargame. An example, how the command zones work. You have command zones which you can capture, just like in Wargame. However, they also have the frontline influence, just like in Steel Division. And also, like in Steel Division, you don't need to keep realign command zones to spawn your units, they just spawn out of the map. The deck building system is another example. You have the divisional based deck building system, like in Steel Division 2. However, there's no phase or income system like Steel Division 2, it's more static, like in Wargame. And without a phase system, they sort of have a pseudo phase system with how forward deployment works. And finally, the suppression system. I'm not going to get too much into it as they are looking to rework it, but it's kind of like Steel Division 2 with stunning and stress, but there's no surrender mechanic. And this is going to be a major question which Eugen Systems is going to have to answer going forward. Because going forward, I don't think just trying to have this weird hybridization of Steel Division 2 and Wargame is going to work long term. You're just going to alienate both player bases. I think Warno is going to have to try to find its own path, so to speak, and try to be its own game without trying to rehash what has been done in the past. And with these, well, upcoming realistic combat changes which were recently announced, I do think this is the path they are going to be taken. And I'm very much looking forward to see what they actually do with these mechanical changes, because there is a very good opportunity here for Warno to just try something completely different in regards to how the game works. I do want to give Eugen big shout outs rather in regards to the soundtrack and graphical presentation of the game. The choice of 18 Synthwave and the Mauser soundtrack is brilliant. They really did a very good job considering that all of their previous games, their soundtrack has been forgettable at best. And the graphical presentation, I don't think I need to get into too much detail. The game just looks bloody fantastic. They've really brought it to the next generation. And I think it's a very good reason why you're now starting to see more people make music and cinematic videos with Warno. Because by God, it's easy to make the game look good. Essentially, its first year of the Warno release has just been about fixing it and making it a playable product. This second year going forward is going to be about trying to find Warno's identity. And I'm very much looking forward to see how that will go. However, we're not done summarizing yet. I know it's just going to keep going on this bloody video. Because there's two more games I want to talk about which aren't Eugen Systems related, but they deserve a mention. The first one being Regiment, as it's released this year, and by God, what a good game. The campaign for all Regiments is one of the best campaigns in an RTS game I played in recent years. I thoroughly enjoyed it, the gameplay's tight, the story was pretty cool with their version of the Cold War of the East German Rebellion. It's a really bloody good game. I did a whole playthrough of it on my channel, I highly recommend you check it out. However, I haven't played the game since I beat the campaign. Reason being, and this is the main issue of Regiment, there's no multiplayer. Now, they are a small dev studio and they have pretty much stated they have no plans to add a multiplayer anytime soon. It's way too much work doing all net coding, and instead they're just going to be focusing on single player content, which I get. It's pretty damn hard to just make a multiplayer game. And it is a crying shame because the skirmish mode, as long as with the game modes for the skirmish mode, are a lot of fun. They did a really bloody good job, and it's a shame that you can't play it multiplayer. I think if it did have a multiplayer, it would have a chance of being, I'm not going to say esports competitive, because that's way out of the league for these types of games, but having some sort of competitive player base. Because the gameplay is bloody tight, the game modes are tight as well. The Conquest mode, where the zones actually change around the map, is a lot of fun. It fixes the main issue of Wargame and Warno, where the game gets very static as you dig in. Here you actually have to maneuver around and stay on your toes. I do hope that in the somewhat distant future, whether Regiment or its sequel, if it does get one, does receive a multiplayer mode, because the game honestly deserves it. And finally, the elephant in the room, the Black Horse, the Broken Arrow, because just recently we've seen a pretty lengthy bit of gameplay from Broken Arrow of some US Marine Corps gameplay in one of the campaign missions, I believe. And goddamn, the game looks really bloody good. Of course, there's still a lot of things to be ironed out, especially the UI, but just how the gameplay works, all the feature mechanics, such as pilots bailing out of aircraft and you having to pick them up to bring in more aircraft, how infantry squad individual units die and that locks out that weapon from being used, how you can pick your transport on the fly. It's really bloody cool. And a lot of these features have been features people have been asking for pretty much since European escalation. I still find it quite crazy. Yeah, it's one of the largest airland battle clans, still Baleka, as well as an ex-Eugen dev, has managed to come together and put together like a very good product from what we see so far. And the interesting dynamic that Broken Arrow is going to have is that this is some of the first competition that Eugen Systems has had in this genre for pretty much a decade. And that's a good thing, even if you are the largest Eugen Systems fanboy, and for some reason you hate Steel Baleka, this competition is good for us in the consumer in the end of the day. Because this is going to force both companies to innovate their product and just give us a better product in the end of it, as they both compete to gain our attention. To be fair, Broken Arrow does seem to be quite different from Warno. It plays more like World in Conflict, and also it being a modern day setting, which is a setting people have been asking for quite a while. So they're not exactly going to be mirror copies of each other. There's a very good chance that we do get a playable version of Broken Arrow, whether it's beta or the full game being released sometime next year. So it's going to be very cool to compare and contrast Broken Arrow to Warno and see how both games end up turning out in the end of the day. Overall, it's a very exciting time to be in this genre of games. We've seen a plethora of content from just Eugen Systems and other developers now, and that makes me extremely happy because I love these types of Cold War, World War II RTS games. I honestly cannot get enough of them. And that's it. That's the year. That's all the things I want to say. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. This has been the longest summary video we've done yet by a country mile. There's just been a heap of content we've had to cover and a lot of things I want to rant about. I want to say thank you very much for everyone who supported this channel over the past year. It's been a very action-packed year and I'm planning to do even more content coming into the new year. So stay tuned around for that. Apart from that, I hope you guys have a lovely New Year's, and as usual, please just take it easy. Oh, before I go, just one more thing. It was a helicopter rush.